Hello, I'm Feliciea Jibson, the Managing Director at Feliciea Limited. I will be interviewing today Professor Sigamoney Naicker from University of Western Cape, South Africa. How are you, Sigamoney?
I'm very well, thank you, and it's good to chat to you today.
So I can see that you have a very interesting background. Where are you?
Yeah, that's Cape Town, and that says that there has to be a balance in life, that you have to fight the good fight, but also relax at the sea.
Fabulous. Everybody will be interested why I'm interviewing you. And then would you like to tell me a little bit about yourself, your career journey as well?
Okay, you know, I grew up in South Africa, and you know, when I grew up, we had a apartheid system where people of different race groups, you know, couldn't socialize and couldn't interact at any level in terms of residence, schooling, use of toilets, use of beaches. That's another reason why I got the beach. It belongs to all of us. And so, you know, it's been well documented, that entire history. So when I went to school, I really wasn't interested in education, because I thought that the education system was not really caring and compassionate and committed to the greater good, because it was a system that was based on division, and it was a system that wanted us to regurgitate information. And so I found schooling extremely problematic. And then I went to university, and I managed to pass school, you know, with all the rebellion and resistance. I passed my schooling. And then when I went to university, I realized when I joined the student boycotts and so on, that education is a very powerful tool, and that you got to educate yourself. But you know, we were never given great opportunities when we were young. And you know, we were put into schools in townships, and fortunately we had some good teachers who I thought were very naive about the world, because they only focused on the classroom, and they never taught us about the broader world and the broader realities and the oppression of the people and so on. So that never entered the debate, and it was discouraged. It was consciously discouraged. And you know, we had very conservative people running schools in South Africa where I went to, and I found the situation in school intolerable. I found it to be extremely challenging and mind limiting. There was no room for growth, and there was no room for the mind to flourish. So when I went to university, I realized that education was important, and I spent a considerable amount of time reading and writing. And then I got a scholarship to the United States, and I met Henry Giroux. And so that was the turning point, meeting Henry Giroux, because Henry Giroux wrote about the liberation pedagogy and so on. And I took a big interest in his lectures on radical pedagogy. And because the South Africans that we were exposed to who were in academia were also quite conservative. They were very soft on the politics, and they never really engaged us in the debates. And it was like a monologue in the lecture rooms. So yeah, I met Henry, who was a vibrant intellectual, and I realized the extent to which we were oppressed. And so then I read Antonio Gramsci's Prison Notebooks, and I understood what it means to be an organic intellectual, and why people like myself who grew up in oppression need to become organic intellectuals where we advance the interests of the working class and vulnerable people. Because that's where I grew up, and that's where I actually escaped from, because it is a place of oppression, it's a place of lack of growth, it's a place of weakness, it's a place of sadness, and I was able to pick myself up from there. And Henry showed me a way. And so Henry is an old man. I'm not too sure whether he's living at the moment. So thank you, Henry. And then I came back to South Africa and I did my PhD, my doctorate in education. And it was about inclusive education, because I realized the importance of including people in education rather than excluding people. Because there's no exclusive society, there's an inclusive society. And so I spent all my years teaching in school, teaching at the university, and working in policy and government, theorizing education, and theorizing the education of the working class and how people are oppressed through education. Our education, and also about how education can emancipate people. And so that's where I am right now. Is that's the kind of work I've done, and I've created those kind of conditions wherever I am. So I'm a very compassionate person. I think I'm a very caring person. I would hardly ever be harsh to people, because I realize that people are product of their experiences, and you've got to nurture people and look at the strengths. And that's my philosophy in life, to create an inclusive environment wherever I am. I do have my limitations. I must say I struggle. You know, it was a huge struggle. For example, the area where I grew up with, there was lots of alcohol and drugs and so on. And it was difficult to escape that life, that kind of life. But you know, I managed to discipline myself in the later years. Because up till now, I still think that people, working class people, are always victims of the vices. And that's a huge challenge. So here I am, quite content to talk to you and tell you that, you know, the problems are not unique to South Africa. The problems exist in the United Kingdom, as we were chatting just now, and the BBC documentary. The problems exist in the United States, where societies have been reproduced for 350 years. If these societies have been reproduced for 350 years, the fault lies with the education system. Because the education is the only tool that can make a major contribution to the transformation of society. So I'll stop there.
Thank you ever so much. And I feel so honored. And I hope the million of listeners that they feel also honored to learn from your experience, to be our role model that we can actually look at, and then to realize that we can do a lot more in this society. And here comes my second question. If it's possible to share with us, why do you believe to be the biggest challenge, opportunities for education at this time?
Well, I think this time in the world, in the 21st century, I think the biggest problem is that education is controlled by personalities. It's controlled by big money, big capital as sabotage education. And I think educationists and educational theorists need to take back education and use education theory and practice to advance education in the interest of the learner. For example, how much of emphasis is there on the work of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? If you don't take seriously that hierarchy, no single individual that enters school will self-actualize. So the budget and the programs must be structured so that there's support for vulnerable children. That's the opportunity. And if vulnerable children get the support, then they can flourish and they can graduate and they can get to university. I'm not saying university is the best thing in the world, but they can further their career. So there's a challenge in education that it's being dominated at the moment by particular interest groups that have little knowledge and have little value for education, because their ultimate objective is rands and cents or money, right? It's the dollar and the pounds that they're concerned about. What we should be concerned about is bringing back serious educational theory and practice into the classrooms of the world. We shouldn't allow children to become victims of the penal system in the United States. The United States as a different disciplinary code for Black children. And we have to change that. We have to create the conditions for children in the harshest school in the harshest conditions to succeed. And we need to provide psychosocial support for those learners. So our point of departure should actually be not a performance culture, not that every child focus on the children that do the best in the system. Our focus should be on taking those children seriously, but also making sure that other children, through support in the foundation phase in the early years, are able to pass their grades later on through a stable, sound foundation.
Absolutely, and we totally agree with you because we share a common passion about inclusion. So can you share with us, where did your passion for inclusion emerged?
Well, listen, I had a passion for inclusion at one stage. And, you know, I still have a passion for inclusion. But I think inclusion doesn't provide the necessary theoretical and practical tools for systems to flourish and become inclusive. Simply because the change to inclusion has been extremely superficial, and it's been a change in language, a change in approaches. There isn't a framework that education follows that holds them accountable in terms of limiting the injustices. Because if a country like the United States can have so many children that are excluded from the mainstream, and a country like Britain ignores special needs to such an extent, then inclusion is not working. You need a social justice model. You need a model of social justice that has a theoretical framework, that has assumptions, that has models, that has tools, and that has practices, that we can ask questions when we plan education, when we budget for education, when we employ people for education. Does this remove injustices? If it's removing injustices, we're on the right track. That's why we need a social justice model. So I think we need to shift from inclusion to social justice, to a social justice model, and create those planning tools that will make education for the vulnerable a possibility.
This is very enlightening for us, and also strengthen what we already know. And in terms of inclusion, you already told us about the system and what we already have in there. What does actually inclusion mean to you?
Well, inclusion for me means an inclusive society. You know, in Belgium and France, they had those terrorist attacks, if you want to call them terrorist attacks, but they were violent attacks on society. But who committed those acts? It's people who have been alienated from schooling in the early years. Why were they alienated from schooling? Because of socioeconomic conditions, because of a lack of tolerance of language, because of a lack of tolerance of culture. So if you want to create an inclusive society, you've got to create inclusive schools. Nobody should be taken out of a school or kept away from a school. Everybody should attend the neighboring school. And I don't care about what people think about the difficulties associated with it. For mass schooling, over the last 200 years, we haven't really had any changes to the system. And so who decides it's difficult? And so there's always money. If you want to have a soccer match, there's always money. If you want to have this big international cup in your country, there's always money. But why isn't there money for education? So, you know, we need to take the money and the personalities and the power out of education. So if we want inclusive societies, we must have inclusive schools. So we celebrate that diversity, we celebrate that culture, we celebrate that language, we celebrate the difference, and so we can have a better society. So the adults in the society don't feel threatened and are not intimidated.
Wow, this is absolutely superb what you tell us, Professor Sigamoney. And continuing on those lines is we want an inclusive education. We look at the inclusive educational system. How do we support learners in this context?
Well, how do parents support their learners? With love. And by understanding that they have strengths and weaknesses. But what do the parents focus on? The parents focuses on the strengths. So we need people, we need to retrain our teachers with a radical pedagogy that looks and encourages possibilities for everyone. So we create the conditions for everybody to succeed. So if you have 5 challenges and you have 1 strength, we'll focus on the strength, right? And so who says that somebody can't succeed? An adult says that somebody can't succeed. Not the learner, because the learner is trying and the learner is not doing so well. So we have to find out what are the barriers in the system. The barriers in the system are poverty. The barriers in the system is inaccessibility to lack of access to services. The barriers in the system is language. The barriers in the system is parents who are not really involved. The other important barrier is poor policy and poor systems, right? So what you do is the system is controlled from the top. The top must change. You have to have a education department says that we embrace diversity. If tomorrow the British Education Department and the American Education Department and in all their states and so on says we embrace diversity, it will change the attitude of every single teacher. So there's a very big difference between saying it's possible and not possible. If you say it's possible, then you look for the opportunities to make it happen. If you say it's not possible, then you disregard the child. And when a schooling system disregards the child, that's the end of the child's life. So that's how we support learners. We embrace their diversity. No matter what the diversity is, and no matter what the challenge is, the child should go to the neighborhood school.
This is very true, and I'm going to keep going on those lines of inclusion and how do we support learners. And then during these challenging times, because we dealt with quite a lot of challenges, we have to praise the teachers and we have to praise the parents that they dealt with so many things, and we also have to praise the children because they dealt with so many difficulties and they made the best of that. But how can we as individuals show solidarity with parents of special needs children and young adults?
So you have reveal, listen, understanding. You have to listen to parents. They will reveal to you how they feel. So I believe that the greatest amount of pain that's experienced by children who represent this diversity is not the child, it's the parent. The parent carries a lot of pain. And the parent carries a lot of pain because of society's construction of children and the level of superficial competition that exists amongst people, right? Because we don't look at the collective good. We're always comparing individuals. And we do not provide adequate support to the parents because there's a stigma and a negative identity that's constructed by society. The fact that you have different schools, you have created a negative identity. The fact that you take children out of a mainstream class or any classroom, you have constructed a negative identity. So we have to operate at 2 levels. We have to change the knowledge, so consciousness change and thinking changes, but we also have to change our practices in the schools where we plan for every child. Every education department in the world must plan for every child. They should not have a special needs section or a psychology section or a section for vulnerable children. They should have one section, and everybody should become aware of the diversity that confronts that education department. And so it's not a task of a few individuals, it's a task of the whole department. And when you do that, when you remove the stigma, when you take away the negative identities, that's how you provide support for parents. And that's the most important thing. Because the parents live in our neighborhoods. The parents are all over the place. And they suffer so much of pain because of the stigma and this negative identity that's been created about their child. I mean, it's so painful. For me, that's one of the most painful things, I think, where people's children have a identity constructed by other people who have no interest in that child.
Yeah, and obviously our misconception, and it's very true what you say about the inclusive education and having a department, could be a complete revolution to the educational system.
Well, that's what we need a revolution. We need a revolution in the education system because the system is not working for so many learners.
Mm.
And so we have an elitist education system that only praises and celebrates the children who succeed. But you know, schools and education departments don't do that because schools reproduce the status quo. If you're middle class, you will succeed because your parents do most of the foundational work. And you go to school and you succeed. But the vulnerable children is actually the challenge of the education department. And that's what needs to happen. We need to create a different society. We need to create a better world, right? And so, in the final analysis, if we don't create this better world, and you and I don't have this conversation, and other people get other people involved, we're not going to change this world. This world will continue to rob people of their dignity, their humanity, and everything that is considered human.
And on the lines of inclusive education and making a system that will embrace and celebrate the strengths, as you said, if we have one strength and 5 difficulties, to celebrate the strength. How can PAGS help us support an inclusive education? Because PAGS is a platform that is an online profiling and progress monitoring tool, and is looking at the strengths in pupils and what areas of development they could work on, and also makes the recommendation of how to work on the exercises. And then will also progress track for that child, will prompt the system to make some input, some notes. So how can you see that PAGS can support this inclusive education?
I think PAGS is on the right track when you say that you profile learners and you focus on the strengths. So yes, that's the point of departure. We focus on the child's strengths, and that's a nice picture because it's celebrating difference and it's celebrating collaboration. And so that's what we have to do. We have to understand what are the barriers. What are the barriers in this child? What barriers this child experiences, what barriers that child experiences, and what barrier that child experiences, and what obstacles does the system put in the way for that child to succeed. And that's how PAGS has to identify the barriers. So is the barriers inadequate policy? Is it inadequate parental recognition? Is it economics? Is it social? Is it access to the environment? What's blocking the access of children to education? And so because we focus too much on individual deficits, right? Now, how can so many children have individual deficits, right? So I'll give you an example. I had a boy in my class. We used to play soccer, and I used to be the soccer coach. And what he used to do was, he used to take the soccer ball, and he never had any direction, right? And the other children used to laugh at him because he wasn't socialized into a sporting family. His parents were very old. I used to visit his parents at their home. And so I told all the other boys in the team, if you ever laugh at this boy, you'll never be part of the school soccer team. If he succeeds, then you succeed. And so after a short time, that boy was a strong member of the soccer team. Because you have to identify the factors that make it impossible for people to succeed, right? And you strengthen them, and it works. You have to have love and compassion for humanity, because every single child matters. And that's how PEGS is going to do it. Identify the barriers, have compassion, have love, and give support to every single child. Because that's what is inclusion. Inclusion is about making things possible for every single person.
This is our aim, obviously, to identify how can we help them, and also to provide a practical solution. And this is the thing that we continuously will continue to develop and work and add and make changes, and in the light of the new research, incorporate that. And what PAGS also does is, and thank you so much for praising and seeing this, is the fact that empowers parents, give parents a voice at the table, because parents will know that my child's strengths are in there, and I can see them, and I can share them, and I can work with them.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, in our discussion, we want to know there is a future. Everybody wants to live with hope, and hope is the future. And what do you think is hope for future?
Well, if you look at the mountains, and if you look at the sea, and if you look at the rivers, and if you look at the trees, and if you look at the waterfalls, and if you look at the beauty of the world, if you look at the animals, and you look at a lion and a tiger, and if you look at a dog and a cat, and if you look at the human body, it's been in existence for 4 billion years. Why shouldn't we have hope? We have passed the First World War, the Second World War, the 1918 swine flu epidemic. People have survived all these things. The human race has always the spirit of survival. And so we can only make it better if we share the resources that I just spoke about. If the resources are shared by people across the world, rather than owned by a few multinationals that only have their bank balance as a major interest. We need to use the resources of the world for all the people. We have to create a system where people are able to show off their talents and their capabilities and so on. But we have to take care of the vulnerable people. Because the vulnerable people and the people who are struggling pose the greatest threat to any hope that we have for the future, right? You saw that in Belgium. People have seen it in France. People have seen it in Syria, whole country collapsing. People have seen it in America with Black Lives Matter. All the fashion designer shoes and designer jeans and designer this and designer that, they were all stolen. And those shopkeepers have lost everything. Some of them have lost their life savings. Why? Because some people, a few people, benefit from society. So we need to create a world where people are educated. And so in the final analysis, you have people with different learning styles and different intelligences. Take the best Belgian soccer player. Do you think he could pass Maths 3 at university? Highly unlikely. It's because his intelligence is different. right?
Yeah.
So people have different intelligences. When you go into the school, in the foundation phase, children have different intelligences, they have different learning styles, and people need to recognize that. You see, my life was a real battle. I never knew anything about learning styles. I never knew anything about intelligences. I just pushed ahead because I knew I needed to do something, and I needed to change how people think about people like me and from where I come from, right? And so I worked very hard at that, right? But I had hope, and hope made me survive. So people have to have hope. In any situation that they are in, they have to have hope. And what do I think hope for the future is? It's love, it's compassion, it's caring for human beings. That is enough hope. Just love, compassion, and caring.
These are so powerful words and really close to my heart. And I am so grateful that you accepted to be part of this interview. And I'm really hoping, sincerely hope, that many millions of people will watch this interview. Because it's love, hope, caring, having empathy, compassion, these are the words that should be at the heart of humanity. And on those lines, a big, big thank you to you.
Thank you.
And I'm so honored. And our connection was made via LinkedIn, and here we come. We had a conference together. We now have a professional discussion. We discuss inclusion. We discuss the society and social justice, and we may follow this up with another professional discussion, with another.
You're welcome.
with another episode. And if people would like to contact you, that will be your details in there. They can write you an email. They can post.
You're very welcome.
If people would like to know about us and what we do and how we are just a seed that we are still to grow into a big tree, and then embrace all the diversity and celebrate the neurodiversity trees.